Hello, my people. Are you ready to party? Utilitarianism Norcross Singer Review. To think about some of the things that came up in your discussions and that always come up that are really, really interesting. So it's going to be a little bit of Mill, a little Norcross, a little Singer. And then I'll see what you think of, because I'm just going to try to give responses that are sort of conventional in what people would say regarding some of the concerns you guys brought up, and then see what you think. And when I say some people would say, it'd be kind of conventional responses that I'd imagine those authors giving. So what do I think, not Mill, but a contemporary utilitarian might say? What do I think Singer might say? Or maybe a better interpreter of Singer. Snuck out. There's things about Singer that I think sometimes he actually worries about being more contentious than he does accessible. So I'll give you my best Singer impersonation. And Norcross is a guy who's at CU, I think still at CU, and every time I can use a reading where it has someone that you guys could actually study with, or it'd be likely that you'll study with, I do. So you can go to CU and take a class from him or pester him. He's super smart, pretty darn funny, very nice. I mean, not as funny as me, but who is that teaches philosophy? No, he's probably funnier than me. Bird watcher. Nature enthusiast, but he's awesome. He's really good. And so that's what I'm going to do. But first I'm going to change the lighting in here a little bit. We'll see if you notice a change, because it seems a little dark and gloomy. I think that's a little better. Hey, wait a second. Let me try something else. Did you notice a change? Well, it helped me. I apologize for the lawnmower in the background, or the leaf blower, or whatever it is, but we'll work through it together. Okay, so first, Mill. Super interesting, cool stuff, and some super interesting, cool comments people made. And so to work through them in a way that makes the most sense, I'm going to start with that chapter 4, the argument for happiness. And it's important to realize, and I think most people did, some people were talking about how it was consistent with their own beliefs. I think Matthew made a really cool post, and I think because it was early on in first, what happens to those posts? They get pushed to the bottom and people don't see them. And I'm going to jump in and do a little more on that to make sure that doesn't happen again. But I want to address, to make sure everybody understands what's going on, right? And we've been talking about it, and we're getting used to it, hopefully more used to it as we go. And by now with Hume, we will be, before we kind of have this, little break of reflection, and then we're going to hit it hard with some really cool theoretical stuff. But, right, this idea that if we're really going to come up with something that really works, then we're going to have to start from scratch. Because we can't make any assumptions that we don't justify, right? We can't not have it be that we are making arguments that are not supported and proven, right? Like the foundation for my argument can't be something that someone can just dismiss, right? So the worry for Hume and Mill is there, and a whole bunch of the people we're going to continue to study, we're going to get to at least 2, maybe 3 more theorists, is, right, like, well, what if I say, right, what were our problems with those first 3 theories, those not-so theories that we looked at? Well, what if I say God? Well, anybody can come along and they're perfectly rationally justified in saying, I do not believe in God. So you can't tell me that your moral beliefs are good for me or good for the world when you can't prove God exists or give adequate justification for God. Your beliefs might be good, but the reason for having them can't be that God said so, because we can't prove God exists. We don't all agree God exists. Well, what if we say it's just the culture? Well, that's all well and good, but a perfectly sane, rational person can say, hey, wait a second, cultures have been wrong before. Why are they right now? And wait a second, you're trying to tell me that morality actually exists and is something I should follow, even though we have these contradictory beliefs by different countries and cultures? That is a contentious claim that we would have to support and have as an additional kind of foundational premise. Or, right, like the egoist stuff. Well, it's self-interest, but we have those problems of, if it's the case that it's all just self-interest, we have the huge problem of why do your interests matter more than mine? And what happens when our interests conflict? And how do we say, right, like we have that metaphysical problem of, how is it that you matter, but I don't, even though we're pretty much the same, other than you're just you and I'm just me? So why is moral consideration not equivalent for everybody? Then we have those problems of when we find those logical contradiction problems. It seems like contradictions are profound problems for creatures like brains with us. We understand them, we recognize them, and we say, oh, geez, stuff's not working when we have contradictions. So all of these theorists, in one way or another, are trying to say either, hey, here's what the foundation looks like, or there is no foundation at all. So when we get rid of all the stuff that we can dispute or disagree about, what's left? And that's what Mill's trying to do, right? Mill, in that chapter 4, was trying to say, hey, look, what's desirable, what's valuable is tied to what's desirable. The only measure for something being desirable is that it's desired. And the only thing that seems to be desired for its very own sake is happiness. That's it. That's the only thing that is definitely positively desired and valuable in and of itself. And all other things that are desirable or a part of happiness or are valuable are because they lead to happiness. And that brings up one of my first responses. I forget who made it. It might have been, oh man, was it Shannon or someone in a discussion post? Sorry, my notes are not good in that they are non-existent. I have a pretty good memory, so it should work. Sorry about that. So whoever made that post, really great question, or a comment, right? Like, we recognize that people do value virtue and money and freedom and friendship and relationships. Those are the sorts of things Mill will say. Yeah, we value those as if they are intrinsically valuable, as if they are valuable in and of themselves. But the only way they are actually valuable in and of themselves is if they are a part of happiness, right? Like another name for happiness in a way. So I wanted to address that concern or question or comment, because he's saying, no, really, literally, the only things that are valuable because they lead to happiness, period. If you have a relationship and it's valuable, it's because it makes you happy. If you have money and it's valuable, it's because it leads to happiness. If you have freedom and it's valuable, the only thing that makes freedom valuable is that it leads to happiness. Virtue, he kind of wants to characterize as a description of character traits that people have that lead to or are expressive of happiness. When he talks about friendship, he'll say, yeah, friendship is valuable in and of itself because it's a type of happiness. So there's a really interesting point there that people might want to poke at a little bit, because it could be tricky, is he's saying literally all of those things are valuable if and only if they lead to happiness or are a type of happiness that we call something else. And what those are, it gets a little tricky, right? Because we have that friendship example of, hey, friendship's good, even if cultivating friendships are good, even if some friendships don't lead you to be happy all the time. And the sorts of arguments that the utilitarian will give are, even if you're in tricky friendships, they were valuable because you learned how to be a friend. Or friendships aren't always going to make you the happiest in the world. However, those sorts of relationships and developing them in general lead you to be happy. The utilitarian can have a tricky time. A strict act utilitarian could have a tricky time with something like parenting and parenthood, because parents aren't happy with regard to their immediate desire satisfaction. They aren't for 18 years. But maybe there's other sorts of things that psychologists have labeled as valuable that are really happiness that you get out of being a parent, right? You get some sort of satisfaction or reward or joy that we don't think of as happiness, but if it's valuable for Mill, the only way it's valuable is it's actually a sort of happiness. So that's one of the big sorts of questions that comes from that chapter 2 that's worth thinking about. And I really appreciate there were a lot of questions about it. But what does that mean foundationally for an ethical theory? It means if we're looking at things and certain things and they don't cause suffering, and we can't directly demonstrate a causal connection between this action and suffering, then they're not going to be wrong. They just aren't. Because for Mill, you won't have an unlimited moral obligation to do what makes people happy, but you'll likely have an unlimited obligation to try to avoid causing suffering intentionally if it's not going to lead to more happiness. So when we look at things, we just have to add it up and put it back on those scales, right? Like, hey, let me think, what are the sorts of things that, right, the issues that are today that I've asked you to do in the Hume assignment are things like kneeling for the Pledge of Allegiance, right? How is that actually directly causing unhappiness? Well, it makes some people mad, but I don't think it's someone kneeling that's making them mad or causing unhappiness. It's their own psychological state and beliefs, right? We get back to sort of my example from a Hume screencast of like, right, the interracial couple walking down the street holding hands. There's nothing inherently causing unhappiness about that. It's my social situation and the culture that I was in 1955 or whenever I set that example. So that should change, because it seems like it's making everybody unhappy if we have a racist society where we don't support interracial couples or something. Because there's nothing inherently causing pain about it. So you can see how people will connect utilitarianism and Hume's sentimentalism. So that's something I really wanted to talk about, is like that second chapter. That argument is really, I think, my interpretation, and I think it's a good one. I think it's decent and conventional. Is really the simplest way to take it is the only valuable things in the world are happiness, things that lead to happiness, and if other things are valuable, it's because people are calling happiness by another name. And it gets interesting to think about, because then you start to think, and it's really cool, why is freedom valuable then? People act as if freedom, ow, freedom, live free, ow, live free or die, I'm from New Hampshire. That's just because that's what their license plate says. I assume it's their state motto. Well, no. Freedom's only valuable if it makes you happy. So we ought to, on a utilitarian grounds, compromise freedom if and when it's going to make people more happy. Now, will it? In certain circumstances, yes. But in general, Mill will say, and other utilitarians will be like, hey, freedom is really valuable, super valuable, because it leads people to greater happiness. And that's a segue into some of the responses to the chapter 2 stuff, where he's arguing about different levels of happiness. And that's where some of those really cool questions were coming from on the discussion board. And you guys were thinking about it in a really interesting way. I just want to hopefully help clarify, right? Mill's saying, and I believe this, again, this goes back to the interpretation I presented in the last screencast, the utilitarianism screencast. He is saying, hey, look, naturally people desire to be happy. Happiness is the intrinsically valuable thing. There are higher and lower orders of happiness, and those higher and lower orders of happiness are natural for people to pursue, right? Like, because of the sorts of creatures we are, right? Like he gives that example, better to be super smart Socrates unsatisfied than a swine satisfied, which might not be the best example because pigs are pretty smart. Now, this is where it gets interesting. He believes there are facts about us, and this is going to answer some of those really good discussion questions, hopefully. He believes there are facts about us, about what sorts of creatures we are and what we like. And this is where I give a little bit of a, if you want to sound smart at parties, it's a little bit of a non-cognitivist viewpoint of utilitarianism. And I'll give another non-cognitivist view on Hume later. That, hey, look, we are creatures who thrive in certain circumstances with certain sorts of emotional and psychological needs being met and physical needs being met. And we're just the types of creature that will do better when we pursue certain sorts of activities and desires and whatever else. So it's a fact about us. Now, here's the part that's interesting that I think it was Matthew touched on, is he believes, and this is where that competent judge argument becomes so important, the only way we have to determine what the higher and lower order goods are is for people to experience them and then be capable and able to honestly, without judgment, experience them, then report out, so we can have people who have experienced both pleasures, and we can say, this is the life we want to live, or this is what's the sort of life that's best for this sort of people. Right? And he believes that's an objective fact. So he believes the rightness or wrongness or the quality of the happiness is an objective fact about the world. There are higher and lower order happinesses. However, he thinks the only way to find that out is to have people experience both and know that they're responding to the experiencing of that particular action or activity or whatever, and then reflect and be like, yeah, I've experienced both lives. This life is better than the other. Now, where it gets tricky and interesting. One, the objectivity question. So it's an objective fact, but the only way we have to know it or establish that fact is if we have competent judges deciding. Competent judges have to have experienced. So if we were trying to decide between the life of partying or the life of intellectual pursuit and meaningful relationships, right? Life of sex, drugs, rock and roll, right? Like you get to rage your face off versus life of committed relationship and meaningful intellectual pursuits and being a good citizen. The only way Mill is consistent is if he says, okay, if everybody had equal access to these two sorts of lives without any negative consequences or judgments from society or artificially constructed ones, and they experienced them both, whatever it is the majority of people would say was the better life is the better life, right? Because we can't come into it with biases and judgments that haven't been confirmed. So if it were the case that 70% of people experienced both those lives and came back and said, yeah, our entire society's stupid. Our structure's stupid. What we advocate for is stupid. Because a life of partying and awesome and casual humping around and whatever else and shooting heroin into your face, that's way more fun and way better and leads to way more happiness than this other. Now, what the utilitarian will point out is no one actually says that. No one who's actually experienced both ever really says that. But it's not because, hey, we've decided that a life of being a good citizen and a good whatever leads to the best happiness. Mill's saying, go look at the people who've done it. And we can look at this and kind of have this evidence for it in really interesting, important ways. And this ties back to some of the examples I'm reiterating again, right? He's saying, hey, if it were true that people who'd lived a life of sex, drugs, and rock and roll and said, and also a life of really loving, caring, committed relationships where they're responsible and did shit and learned and whatever. And those people came back and they all reported, dude, it's a joke. It's a lie. You've been taught by some bullshit social structure that committed relationships are cool, that being productive matters, that you want to go out and live. You're just some kind of shill for a capitalist system when you should all just be smoking weed in the basement with Chad, whatever I was doing, watching porn and playing video games and eating some kind of junk foods, always in that example. That's what we should be doing. Now, the problem with that, right, is not that there are facts about those lives. We can't rely on other reasons, right? The only measuring stick is happiness. We can't say, well, this other life is better because it fits our social norms or we like it better. We have to erase all those reasons. We just have to look at them as objectively as we can. Chad in the basement, Chad out in the world. How do we determine which is better? We ask people who've experienced both. And when we ask people who have experienced both, which is better quality, Mill's going to say we always get the same answer, right? Then you can think about it, and it's kind of true, right? Who's going to want to give you the line of, well, the rules don't matter. I should live the life however I want. And it's just social stigma and creation. It's like kind of half-assed, not so well justified relativists or subjectivists who probably took a class that covered some postmodern stuff and think they understand it or something. Or it's people who just want to smoke a lot of pot and hang out in a basement. People who've really done it, you want to go talk to people who've really, really done it. People who've really partied their face off. But they also have to have had a time in their life where they've had really meaningful, loving, caring relationships, really meaningful, committed themselves to really meaningful work, whether they were making money or volunteering or doing whatever else. And just about every one of those people say what? We're way happier the other way, right? Like this life, that other life is easier. And this is where it gets to his explanation. It's cheaper. It's easier. You don't have to worry about failure as much, right? Like it's really easy. Anybody who's been a drunk or a drug addict or knows a junkie or a drunk, right? It's really easy to forget about how miserable you are after 6 to 8 cocktails, right? Or after you smoke a bunch of weed, or after you do a bunch of drugs. And so you believe yourself to be super happy, but you might not be. And those times when you're not happy, the suffering probably is not worth it, right? Now, this is where he's going with those examples that I put on the assignment that people really did pretty well in understanding, is saying, hey, look, when you look at people who appear to choose otherwise, it's because they just don't know any better, or they're wimping out. Now, this is where it gets crazy and can blow people's minds. How do we distinguish between, right, given Mill's thing? What if I say, hey, we want to say Chad in the basement is wimping out. We want to say Chad in the basement is settling for a life of smoking pot and porn and video games and Cheetos, flaming hot Cheetos, or we're at whatever he's doing, because the other life is so valuable. But what if we woke up tomorrow and 99% of people who had experienced smoking pot in the basement, hanging out, eating Cheetos, or the people who had the life of partying and drugs and sex, we woke up tomorrow and everybody who had experienced both came to the realization, you know what? Just party your face off. That's what's really the most fun. That's the most rewarding life there is. Mill would say, and have to say, and the utilitarian of a million sort would have to say, that's a better life. It just is. It's just better. But this is what the person who wants to say, oh no, it's all relative and this is just as good a life, ignores, and Mill will not ignore, is he's saying that just doesn't happen, and it hasn't happened. I'm looking at the empirical evidence. I take people who've actually experienced both, and they want to say, oh shit, this one's way better. Because you look at the people who've experienced both, and oftentimes they'll have one of those in the past, and have genuinely experienced both. Right? The recovering alcoholic who's been sober from 10 years is really trying to stay sober. They're not saying, oh, I want to go party my face off. So there's interesting questions there, and there's a tension in there. But Mill is definitely committed to saying, hey, there are objectively better lives. The only way we know some lives are better is when people experience them. So we have to experience them. There's nothing inherently wrong about doing drugs. There's nothing inherently wrong about drinking. There's nothing inherently wrong about having casual sex and whatever else, if you don't consider the happiness that's created. What Mill's saying makes them wrong is the people who participate in those lifestyle choices are not as happy as they could be. So if it were making them as happy as they could be, he'd be like, okay, that's fine. He has to, because he can't contradict himself. He has to rest on happiness. So some of the examples that are really important to consider are, we start to think about it, and I'll put it in this context because I just mentioned it, and it's one of those contemporary issues for the human assignment, right? When we look at what people are talking about with regard to race and protesting stuff, because of the disparity, at least they believe there's a disparity between the opportunities and the way in which black folks are treated in this country and white folks are treated in this country. And in general, we can look at some data that really supports that. Or we could do rich Rich pokes? Rich pokes and four pokes. This is all about apparently Wyoming now. It's a Wyoming mascot reference. They're the Wyoming Cowboys and people call them pokes. All right. Cow pokes. It's a bad joke if you feel you need to explain it to your audience, so I apologize for that. No bueno. Can't believe I just did it. Oh well. We'll challenge your cognitive flexibility a little bit more. So, what they're saying on utilitarian grounds, it's just an example of how you might apply it, is, hey, wait, if it's the case, which it is, these are actual, totally righteously factual numbers as much as we can get. And the research is actually pretty good. We can find it if you're interested. I'll give you two examples, right? In this country, black people in general, and the numbers will go way up if we do certain age groups, are 7 times as likely to get shot by police as white people. Now, why? Right? It seems like someone might say, hey, protesters have a reasonable justification to want to draw attention to something like that. We can look at graduation rates, everything else. And it brings me to another interesting topic that I'd be happy to talk about, and I talk about sometimes in other online classes, right? This notion of racism, people get it all wrong, right? Like there's two different things to talk about racism, right? The institution is set up such that it's racist in that it advantages white people over black people. But then you have the other sort of racism people want to talk about, which is like racial prejudice or bias, which is individuals making biased or prejudiced judgments based on race. The protest sort of thing is about an institution, right? And it seems like it's saying, hey, something's wrong with the institution, because black people aren't born saying, I want to be 7 times as likely to kill people. And if you're going to say there's something inherently about black folks that makes them make those choices, then you have a theoretical problem. I'm not even saying it's true or false, but then you just come out and say, I am actually racist and I genuinely believe it's their fault because they're born that way. Because Mill would be saying, deep down inside, or a utilitarian would be saying, deep down inside, no one wants to have a life where they're led to be 7 times as likely to be shot by a cop. That seems crazy. Nobody wants to do that. So why is it happening? On utilitarian grounds, we can say, right, like this is where we can tie it into Mill. Hey, either, what are the reasons he says people might be put in situations that are less than ideal for them? They feel like they're not capable because of something they've been taught. Opportunities have been deprived them, so they've become jaded. It's hard as shit, and they aren't equipped with the tools to overcome that hardness, the difficulty. There's parts of the structure or whatever is happening around them so that different opportunities have been eliminated from their option, or they don't see them as an option, right? And I always use a classic example because it comes to race stuff. Because the justification people used in the 80s and early 90s for affirmative action sorts of programs, which really, it's funny because they don't really exist that much anymore, but people really worry about them sometimes. There aren't a ton. No one's like has quotas really, like, oh, we have to hire 12 black people. That doesn't really exist in the United States anymore, Barry. If it does, it's not legally required, that's for sure. So, but some of the justification, and it makes sense, right? Like if I'm Chad and I grew up on, in Harlem, in New York, on like 198th Street or something, in a project, and it's 1987, and I look around and I say, okay, what is the world telling me is the measuring stick for success and happiness? Well, in the United States, it'll be money, success, by making money, or fame, or whatever. Well, what are the reasonable options when Black Chad, just to verify that, and I'm 15 and I'm looking at the world, and I'm saying, well, shit, it's hard to get to school and get an education. Particularly given some of the stuff socially I have to navigate to get there. The people I see who are being successful, are considered to be successful, are people who've taken a different route, a slightly illegal route maybe. I might see that. Those are the people who I see who look like me. the world's telling me I'm not really going to be able to do anything else, right? I look to the world to see, and what's imprinted upon me is what I'm capable of, particularly in 1987. I see, well, black folks succeed, black dudes succeed if they are good athletes or entertainers. Well, that's like 1 in a million. So what might I do? Right? Some of the arguments for how and why we would need to create opportunities for black people in the workforce, in management positions, in leadership positions, is because if you don't have them there, people internalize that those options aren't available to them. Right? That's exactly the sort of thing Mill was talking about. Now, all of what I just said might be totally false, but that's a sort of utilitarian justification based kind of on what Mill was saying, right? Like Mill's saying, hey, look, if people don't believe these things are true for themselves and they don't have support and the opportunities to overcome and do it, then it just doesn't happen. That's only one example. You think about all the other millions of things that would be facing me if I'm Chad in that situation in 1987. And I see not just what I see, but the practical things. Hey, look, if I'm there in that economic situation, the likelihood of me having 2 parents and one who's going to support me, not very good. One who's going to support me in my education, they might try, but if they're working 9 jobs or 2 jobs or whatever else, how much time do you have to give to help your kids with homework, right? Like, so I might not have the support to reach some of the more challenging things. So seems like the world might be telling me, and I might be embracing, screw the higher order pleasures of trying to be whatever. What am I going to go for? The quick, easy fix, right? I can sell drugs. I can do whatever. That's one sort of example, right? I'll give you another example in the same kind. Exact same statistic, just about. They're really close to one another. People with 2 college-educated parents and, well, people with in the highest third of the income bracket are 7 times as likely to complete college as those in the bottom third tax bracket. What? And if you can make it smaller and make it even more obscene. The difference. Why? Not because rich people are smarter or better. It's not because they're rich, probably. But think about what Mill's argument is, right? Like, if you don't have the support, you don't have the resources, it becomes really hard. Right? What happens? Those people will likely have 2 parents with a college education. They likely have parents who are working with their kids on their homework every night. They likely have people who are around their kids who are using language that's really native to and embraced and supported. My fingers are off the screen. By academia. Life becomes way easier. Right? It's way easier when it would be way easier if we look back to Mill, right? Like this utilitarian sort of argument. If I'm in the bottom income bracket, I likely have challenges to face that make this lower order happiness appealing, right? Why? Well, school's really hard. School can be really hard. It's really hard when you don't have people who know how to navigate it and can help you with everything from how to react to a teacher you don't like, to advising, to school counselors, to social situations in school. And who's more likely to have parents who've navigated that? Rich folks. Particularly our generation, because our generations from me and earlier, because the people who were making enough money to put them in that top third, all had college education. Or the vast majority of them did. And if they didn't, at least the people who made that much money learned to navigate some of the rules and regulations. So I might be 7 times as likely to go to college because I have the support. I have someone doing homework with me. I have someone coaching me along. I have someone pointing out errors in the way and correcting my grammar when I'm speaking in a positive way, right? Like the modeling, the reading that people learn, they don't learn it in school. They learn it when their parents read to them. They learn it when their parents do homework with them and help them with their homework. It's a lot harder if you're learning it and trying to learn it in 5th or 6th or 7th grade. Now, does that mean it can't be done? Of course not. That's why individually and personally we want to say, let's take it on the person individually to take responsibility and accountability to overcome those things to try to achieve those higher order happinesses, whatever they may be. Whether it's poor white folks or black folks or whatever, we say individually we want them to be responsible and accountable, and we want to praise them when they overcome those obstacles and rock it out. But then also we probably ought to understand, and this is where we connect Colin Kaepernick and John Stuart Mill, we probably ought to understand, hey, look, no one's really choosing lower order goods. It's just not part of our nature. They're settling for it. And in the protests right now that are going on, it seems very much like people are trying to call attention to it and saying, hey, look, why is this happening? Why is this really happening? If it's true that people really want to be happier and the only reason they won't and don't pursue those higher order happinesses is if they think they can't do it, it's unattainable, they've been told they don't have it, it's not a legitimate choice for them, which is going to be a real circumstance, right? Like you think about what are folks in the bottom third of the tax bracket more likely to have to do when they're 15 and 16? Start working to help support their family, right? That makes it harder to go to school. Not impossible, but harder. So Mill's pointing out, hey, look, we know what the higher and lower order happinesses are if we give people the freedom to experience them, and then we trust people who are competent judges. We might be saying, hey, look, whether it comes to race or economic inequality, and this is really a utilitarian explanation of what people are talking about when they're talking about privilege, some people are advantaged with regard to pursuing higher order happiness because of no fault of their own or no credit of their own. They were just born in situations where they were more likely to overcome those four things that make higher order happinesses seem unattainable. Or 4 or 5 things, depending on how you interpret it. So that's really interesting stuff, theoretically, to me. And so I hope I addressed some of the concerns people have. I also wanted to tie it to something contemporary and one of the topics that I threw in the Hume thing, just in case. I also wanted to change hats a few times just to be loco crazy and see if if you tell me the number of times hat changes I had, I will be giving you extra credit. I'm keeping track. And the people who are watching all the screencasts and telling me the extra credit stuff and turning stuff in, it's going to be like impossible for them to get less than like a B because of all of the screencasts they've watched. But the point of the screencast is to really start thinking, how do we apply this stuff? And for Mill, it's happiness is the only valuable thing. You got to throw everything else out if he's right. How do we measure that? Well, some happiness is, we want to measure the quantity and the quality of the happiness. Sometimes it's very easy to look at the quantity of it, but the quality, the only measure for the quality of it is what do people experience and what do people who've experienced both, how do they choose? And that leads to that really tricky question of what if everybody chose and decided that smoking weed and playing video games in the basement was more fun and a happier existence? If it ends up being that way, then we should have a world where we're giving everybody weed and video games. If we can make that happen. But Mill's going to say that's not the way it is. So that'd be like saying, well, what if it were the case that lions really flourished and had the best life they could while eating kale salads? Be like that, then you should feed your lion kale salads. But that's not what the world looks like. And then we have that tie-in to a contemporary social issue of, hey, maybe some of these things we talk about in everyday life, these theories that we're talking about can really explain in much better ways than people are talking about them, right? If it's 7 times as likely to get shot to death by a police officer because I'm black, right? Not saying police officers are even being biased or racist. Something about the world is such that you're 7 times as likely to get shot. Why is that? Right? Maybe it's because people are pursuing or in situations where they're getting shot more often due to no fault of their own or due to the difficulty or challenges that are more affect them more so than other people. Because you got to be able to explain that 7 times, right? Unless you're just going to say black people are criminals in their hearts. And if you do that, then you just got to go get a white sheet and a funny hat and get your racist on. Right? That's just the only other explanation, is that they naturally choose it. which be a little weird to commit to that. Similarly, why are rich people more likely to go to college? Well, we could come up with some other explanations, but it seems like a mill example, right? Like, hey, in general, people who have higher education and work jobs where they're making a better living tend to have health care, tend to have more free time. For the most part, people dig that. So why aren't poor folks doing it as successfully? Well, they don't have the same sort of advantages in helping overcome the obstacles that make the higher order pleasures tough to get to sometimes. Right? I will tell you, I did not have to work to give money to my parents and help support the family. Ever. That's a really important thing. Both of my parents probably had to, which is interesting. Both of my parents are from farming communities. I'll use them as an example again at some point. In eastern Colorado, Ray, Colorado. Shout out to Ray for anybody who spent some time at the Kansas border. So that was a really long mill discussion, but it was really fun for me, and probably miserable for you. You have no idea what I believe. And if you disagree with some of the things I said, awesome. That's where we're at now in the semester. People have been getting comfortable enough kind of talking about stuff in a really easy way. I'm going to challenge people and be contentious a little bit. Not in a mean-spirited let's fight way, but in a let's get closer to the truth. So if you're listening to this and you're like, Chad, that is horseshit. How are you saying that black folks have less of an opportunity to avoid being shot to death by police than white people do? You can make those sorts of arguments. I want to see them. So I'm going to quit with Mill and just make the screencast about Mill, and I'll give you another one that's Norcross and Singer, because this ended up being really long. And I hope that there was something interesting in it for you. If not, it was a challenge for you to stay focused for 42 minutes. Thank you so much for your time. Remember, number of hat changes. Email it to me. And if you get it right, I'll give you some points. Have a great day. Bye.